Ultamize. If you want to become more effective, immediately reduce the time between deciding to do something and actually doing it. Because most delays do not come from lack of ability, they come from hesitation. You think about starting, you consider it, you plan it some more, but you do not act right away. And that gap creates resistance. For example, you decide you should begin a big task, but instead of starting, you wait. You check something else. You prepare a little more. You tell yourself you'll begin in a moment. That moment stretches. And the longer the delay, the harder it becomes to start. This is a common pattern, and it has a simple solution. Start sooner, not perfectly, just sooner. For example, when you decide to do something, begin with a defined short window of time. Could be 10 seconds, 30 seconds, 1 minute. That reduces the opportunity for hesitation and it builds momentum. Another important factor is clarity because hesitation often comes from uncertainty. If you're not sure what the first step is, you're more likely to delay. If your task is vague, starting feels difficult. But if your task is clear and specific, starting becomes easier. If you just say, I'm going to write a business plan, but you don't know what business you're going to get into or what problem you're going to solve, that's too vague. Maybe the first step is decide what type of a business you actually want to start. That's why defining the first action matters, not the entire task, just the first step. For example, instead of thinking about completing a large project, focus on a simple action like opening a file or writing a single line. That removes complexity. And complexity, as we've talked about before, leads to delay. Another useful approach is to lower the threshold for starting because sometimes you hesitate because the task feels too large. Start a multi-billion-dollar startup. Well, that's too big. Focus on something much, much smaller, solving one problem for one customer. That's a smaller start. If you reduce the size of the starting point, the barrier becomes smaller. For example, commit to working for a short period of time, not to finishing everything, just to beginning. Once you begin, continuing is easier. This is because action creates momentum and momentum reduces resistance. Another key point is awareness because hesitation often happens automatically. You may not even realize you're delaying. For example, you might switch to something else without thinking. By the time you notice, time has passed. By becoming aware of that moment, you can interrupt it. You can choose to act instead of delay. Another important aspect is consistency because shortening the gap between thinking and doing is a skill. And like any skill, it improves with repetition. Now, let me be clear. Sometimes people just say, well, I'm going to act, 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 and they quickly start a half baked business that has no plan whatsoever for success. They should have done more due diligence. They should have asked people, would you use this product? Is there a need for this service? What problem do you have that I could solve? So I'm not suggesting you don't want some planning and thinking and reflection before doing, but for most people, the problem is too far the other extreme. It's continuing to think, delay, plan, and never actually take action. That's the far more common problem. Each time you act quickly on a decision, you reinforce that behavior. It becomes more natural. Over time, hesitation decreases and action becomes your default. I'll give you a perfect example. My own career as an online course creator. I have created hundreds and hundreds of online courses. Many of them I did pretty quickly without spending 6 months of additional research. Most of them have not been huge, huge successes, but dozens of them have become international bestsellers. I wouldn't have gotten those dozens to be international bestsellers without doing the other hundreds that didn't succeed. I became successful by taking action much faster, creating more quality because I created more quantity. That's a concept that I think is often overlooked by people, especially if they just tell themselves, oh, I'm going to be a perfectionist. Another benefit is that it reduces overthinking. As I just mentioned, the sense of trying to be a perfectionist is really just overthinking things and delaying. Overthinking often happens in the gap. The longer you wait, the more you analyze, and analysis can lead to inaction. But when you act quickly, you bypass that cycle. You move forward, and movement creates results. Another point to consider is that not every action needs to be perfect at the start because improvement often happens after you begin. For example, your first attempt may not be ideal. I know my first online course wasn't very good. My first podcast wasn't very good, but they were essential steps in getting me to where I am today. It gives you something to work with when you begin, and that's better than not starting at all. The goal is to create a pattern of action, decide, then begin without unnecessary delay. Because when you shorten the gap between thinking and doing, you increase your output, you reduce hesitation, and you build momentum throughout your day. That's what leads to consistent progress.